It's been said that 1543 is the year zero in medical daring. This is when On the Structure of the Human Body by the Brussels-born anatomist Vesalius was published. It features almost surreal images of the human skeleton in allegorical poses. Vesalius said of the study of anatomy that the violation of the body would be the revelation of its truth. This book is said to be the foundation of modern anatomy. But in this highly technical and specialised area of medicine today, what books do doctors read now? We're taking the scalpel today to uncover the role of the written word in some overachieving doctors' lives. To talk about the vocational reading of the medical profession, I'm joined by Jayashri Kulkarni, Rod Hicks and Chris Merry. Chris Merry is a fellow of the College of Surgeons specialising in cardiothoracic surgery. He practices heart and lung transplantation at the Alfred Hospital and at the Western Hospital in Footscray. He also presented Melbourne's Triple R radio show Radiotherapy on Sunday mornings. Jayashri Kulkarni is Professor of Psychiatry at the Alfred and Monash University since 2002. Jayashri has pioneered the use of oestrogen as a treatment for schizophrenia and is a leader in the field of reproductive hormones and their impact on medical health. She directs a large psychiatric research group at the Monash Alfred Psychiatric Research Centre. And Rodney Hicks is Professor of Medicine and Radiology at the University of Melbourne and Director of the Centre for Molecular Imaging at the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre in Melbourne. His specialty is in developing imaging techniques with PET scans for cancer diagnosis and treatment. He's also the first one in his office to own an e-reader, and he's probably the first one on the panel to own an e-reader too. Please welcome them to the book show. Well, I don't expect that you've got Vesalius's book on your bookshelves, but it was revolutionary at the time. But the book, I guess, that epitomises the practice of medicine now, and maybe in the minds of people who aren't doctors, but perhaps in the minds of people who are, is Gray's Anatomy. In 1858 it was published as Henry Gray's Anatomy of the Human Body. I'd like to know when each of you got your copy of Gray's and how it made you feel. Jayashri.
I got my first copy of Gray's Anatomy when I was a second-year medical student, and I bought it in India, and it fell apart about 3 months later.
Why?
So, well, it was just one of those very cheap publications, and the pages all just fell apart and everything else. And so then I eventually saved up to buy another one, and I think it was about $450 at that time, which was, you know, this is going back several centuries now when I was a medical student. It was very expensive, and I have probably looked at it once, but it sits there on a bookshelf.
But as a student you would have looked at it?
No, not really.
All right, well, we'll have to uncover the reasons why a little bit later. What about Rod?
Well, that's why Jayashri became a psychiatrist, perhaps, rather than a surgeon. I got my first Gray's Anatomy in first year of medical school, and it was actually the first medical textbook I bought. I loved anatomy. I actually was an anatomy demonstrator at Monash University for a while, and really felt very strongly towards it. I actually have a copy of from the folio collection of Vesalius's De Fabrica de Corpora Humanis, on the fabric of the human body. And it's ironic you were talking about that, because I was actually showing slides to the medical students on medical imaging, cancer imaging, just last week, and showed them pictures of the human brain dissected by Vesalius, which looks uncannily like an MRI of today.
So, Chris Merry, I mean, you're a surgeon. Surely you would have looked at Gray's Anatomy a little bit more than Jayashri.
Yeah, probably. I mean, I prefer the television show now to the book, but because the surgeons are so good looking. But no, I was pretty lucky. I got my first copy of Gray's Anatomy, I think, when I was in high school. My mother had stolen a copy from the Warrnambool Hospital Library, and that was on our bookshelves there. And I remember looking at it when I was a high school student before I got to university. And I think along with sort of the big Reader's Digest atlases that used to be published of the world. It was just fascinating because not only, as Jayashri said, it's an enormous book. The paper is like cigarette paper. It is so thin, but the drawings in it are so precise. Now, in those days, and even now, most of it went way over my head because it's incredibly difficult reference book. But in terms of the magnitude of the tome, it's a very, very impressive piece of work.
Did you all feel like, okay, we've arrived, we're actually doing medicine now, we've got this book?
No, my first stethoscope was more, that's when you
It was
arrived.
the white coat, I think.
Yeah. And, yeah.
Well, my daughter's actually a fourth-year medical student, and I gave her my copy of Gray's, and she's going to be a psychiatrist because she hasn't opened it yet.
Look, in defence, I have to say that, okay, I did spend a lot of the anatomy lessons at Monash in the cafeteria, but when we went back into psychiatry, we had to do a lot of neuroanatomy, and so then we used we used the specimens in the anatomy museum, and I found that the three-dimensional actual specimens much easier to learn from.
All right, well, you've all specialised in different areas. One uses the scalpel, one uses talking and drugs, and one uses medical technology to image what's happening inside people. So I'm interested in what books are specific to these particular fields. Chris, what do you do after Gray's Anatomy? What sort of books have you read towards the surgery?
So the first lot in surgery is to get the basic sciences under control, and so again it's the Gray's Anatomy and the pathology and the physiology textbooks. But once you subspecialise or specialise, there are enormously thick surgical textbooks that are basically, again, just references of every operation that is possible to do in your field or every pathological condition in your field. And then as an adjunct to that, because we tend not to use medication as much as the other specialties, there's usually a collection of atlases which then have hand drawings of each steps through the complicated operations, everything from appendix operations through to heart and lung transplantation. You can find an atlas which has just basically like a user's guide to programming your VCR, but a little bit easier to understand, and that gives you an idea about where you are. And I use those books regularly for the night before surgeries that I haven't done before or haven't done in a long time.
Just to swat up.
Yeah, well, it looks better than having someone hold the book up to you while you're in the operating theatre.
Those pencil, those hand drawings.
Yeah.
They're more useful than in a photo?
Yeah, I think they are, because the advantage of a hand drawing is it can convey contrast a lot better than perhaps a photo of a stylised drawing can convey contrast better than a photo of the same technical area. Plus, you're not restricted in drawings by having different anatomical variation. You can draw in whatever you like.
And you don't sort of a book stays relevant? You don't have to update it all the time because the body doesn't change that much?
Because a lot of the operations that I do are very standard procedures that have been developed over 30 or 40 years and have been honed to a point where they have become the standard of care. And so for those operations, the books are generally what you would accept as being the standard of care. And so we're talking about things like heart transplantation, the approaches to the heart, the approaches to the valves within the heart, which have been developed by surgeons over many years. Now, there are newer techniques and newer ways of doing things coming on all the time, but they're not in the books, obviously, and for that you usually turn to the journals or the internet.
What about you, Jayashri? Where do you go after you've left that Gray's Anatomy and you haven't looked at it? What books lead you into psychiatry?
Well, see, psychiatry is so broad. It has the neuroscience end, which we work in, as well as the humanistic, creative end, and then the whole clinical spectrum in the middle. So one of the things that I remember one of my psychiatry lecturers from way back said, if you want to understand psychiatry or human behaviour, go to the classics in literature, go away from the medical texts and so on, and actually go to Shakespeare and go to the actual classics, because what you've got there is you've got human nature, perhaps some simplified in the characters, but you've got a real richness of character. So I think that's probably what attracted me, was to look at different characters and their personalities and what they do and so on.
What about the books written by Freud or...
Yeah, I had to, they made us do a whole lot of that. And Jung was just unbelievably complicated, but it's, you have to have some of that as a grounding, interpretation of dreams by Freud and so on, but modern day psychiatry really doesn't have much to do with that at all. I mean, I think people haven't quite caught up with modern day psychiatry as not having, I don't have a couch that people lie on, and we don't spend endless time talking about breastfeeding versus bottle feeding or any of that. I mean, it's very, very different. And the only things that really very much exist are to say there is a subconscious process and there's a conscious process and so on, but a lot more eclectic in input. I particularly love the work of Yalom. He wrote Love's Executioner and those sorts of books, which really tell people in a story way what happens to individuals.
These are case studies.
These are case studies.
But they also involve the response of the therapist, don't they?
Yeah, and so I think that's a really nice way for people to actually understand a bit more. I often tell my students to go and read those books, and I don't make them read Freud and Jung unless they're particularly interested.
Unless you're punishing them. Rod Hicks, you've developed an important area of cancer research and diagnosis and treatment using PET scans, PET scans. So, in a way, you would have written the textbook in this area.
I was, as you were talking, I was trying to think of if I hadn't written the textbooks, they weren't there when I needed them in that area, and so.
But what led you to that area? What books did you have along the way?
Actually, I got interested in imaging through cardiology. I was training as a cardiologist, and the new technology in cardiology was PET scanning, looking at the metabolism of the heart. And I went overseas to the United States to do that. And when I arrived there, I saw one of the first cancer PET scans that was ever done in the world in the early 90s. Actually, it was 1989, the year that my daughter was born, and I saw a scan of a woman with breast cancer, and we were able to see not only her breast tumour but secondary deposits which hadn't been recognised before, and even in retrospect, going back and looking at the CT scan, we couldn't see. And with an N of 1, we call it the perfect experiment, I knew immediately that this was a game changer in the diagnosis of cancer. And my grandmother had actually died when I was in medical school of breast cancer, having been given the all clear by a CT scan and then gone on a European trip and fallen over and broken her hip through a metastasis in her bone that had been completely unrecognised. And I thought, well, this is going to change the way we do cancer medicine, and I decided I would specialise in this particular area. So I changed my whole career path, and here we are in 21 years later, and my daughter's just had her 21st birthday. She was born in the year that I saw that first PET scan, and we still don't use it for breast cancer, which is probably an indictment on my science.
Well, Chris, you go around sticking knives into people, and
in a calculated and very technical way, yes.
It's a very
and I help him to know when to cut.
I mean, PET scanners. Yeah. Well, this isn't really about PET scans though today. So no. Sorry. Go on, please.
Did you have to read something in order to help you do that? To overcome a natural inclination not to?
Oh, I'm going to sound like a psychopath if I say no.
That's all right, I can help out.
Can we bring the couch up that we don't use? One thing I think that people don't understand who haven't been in surgery is that it's not like attacking someone with a knife, in a personal way. It's all very sterile and controlled. It's even less confronting than dissection was as a medical student, because you don't see the whole person. My area that I see is about the size of an iPad, which is basically the part of the chest that I've squared off to operate on. And once you're through that, you do see only the inside of the person, obviously. And so the face, and particularly the face, is well blocked. But having said that, during residency, obviously I did other forms of surgery, and I must say I found the nose operations and the toe operations the most difficult to do, because I think they were the two parts of the body, for some reason toes, I don't know why, but toes and noses were two parts of the body that were most identifiably human, rather than just being, I mean, people don't get squeamish when they carve a roast lamb, I presume, or prepare a chicken for roasting. And in some ways, when you're in surgery, in that very clinical environment, It's a similar kind of feeling. Having said that, I read widely around the issues of people who are going through surgery or who have had surgery.
Like what?
Well, there's been a number of books really that have come up very recently, written from the surgeon's perspective of work. There's a lovely one called Direct Red, which was written about 2 years ago by a female ear, nose and throat surgeon in the UK. And she talks through a number of vignettes about her experiences in the operating theatre. There's another one called Making the Cut by a New South Wales urologist called Dr. Kandra, and he writes again a series of vignettes exploring the ethical issues that come up in surgery. So not about whether or not to make a cut here or a cut there, but what is the effect on the patient, but also back onto the surgeon. And they've been very revealing later in my career, or after my training, I guess, having been finished, to look at what the responses are that you perhaps subconsciously have during surgery and how to deal with those.
Well, Rod Hicks, you mentioned the missing of your grandmother's hip tumours that meant that she went away when she thought everything was going to be all right. What about medical mistakes and avoiding error? Is there something you read around that?
Not in particular with respect to books. There's a lot of medical audit literature that comes through in all areas of medicine now, and they're usually through the journals that we all read within our specialties, and with electronic PDFs now and connection through things like Google Scholar, PubMed. It's very easy to access those electronic articles, which are really very specific to the particular question you have at any given time. Often textbooks are already out of date by the time they're published, and they have the focus of the author rather than of the reader. And so in terms of accessing vocational reading, I tend to use the internet and to use those search engines a lot these days.
There is a fantastic book which I'm sure you've both read called Complications by Atul Gawanda, who's a surgeon in Boston, and he writes for the first half of the book, he writes solely about the processes that go wrong for mistakes to happen in medicine, and he talks about the Swiss cheese theory where a number of things have to the holes have to all line up in order for something to go wrong, but that gives an overview of the system errors that can occur and why they occur. And again, that's been fascinating reading for someone who's sort of involved at the pointy end of it all.
Well, Jayashri, you did emergency medicine when you graduated, and you chose to leave that behind. Was that because... why?
Well, I actually did quite a lot of emergency medicine for several years after I did internship, and it's had all that glitter and the glamour of like ER, and it's all sort of go, and then it struck me that I wasn't ever seeing the outcomes. It was like being on an assembly line, and you're at the front end, and so you put together the bits just to get the person off to somewhere else. And eventually, after the sort of the glamour of it, if you can call it that, wore off, it struck me that I really wanted to know more about the person, the patient, the person in the patient, and that wasn't possible in the emergency department, and it still isn't really a possibility. We do a lot of emergency psychiatry in the emergency department, and it isn't. It's very much the MASH kind of end of it. So to get to be able to do that, I really went into psychiatry, but I was also very sceptical about the psychoanalytical movement and that end of it. So I wanted to actually be in the other end, which was to apply medical principles, neuroscience, to bring that to bear much more on the discipline of psychiatry. I'm still pretty disappointed that psychiatry is primitive in our diagnostic capacities and our treatment capacities. We're a long way behind cardiology or some of the other specialties, and that's why I think my job is to try and bring the neuroscience discoveries into the field so we can improve the state of psychiatry.
Well, this is the Book Show on ABC Radio National. I'm Ramona Koval, and I'm here at the Wheeler Centre in Melbourne for our monthly Reading on Vocation event. Today with doctors Jayashri, Kulkarni, Chris Merry and Rod Hicks. Let's talk about bedside manner. Probably, Rod, you're not as close to the bedside as you used to be. Or maybe you are. But what books have guided you with help or with your bed or your desk side manner?
I would say, like Jayashri said, the general reading outside medicine, teaching you about life, the experiences of normal human beings. That's really where I get my life experience, as well as obviously interpersonal reactions that we have, relations that we have with people.
I mean, what about books on death and dying, because you're working in cancer?
Yeah, a lot of people have that impression that it must be really depressing, that I must need Jayashri's services all the time working in a cancer hospital, but certainly working at Peter Mac is an incredibly uplifting experience. We have such fantastic interactions with our patients, and we do get to see the outcomes of what we do. As well as, although you might think that an imaging person doesn't see patients, they sit in front of a computer screen or an X-ray screen. I see patients every day, I talk to patients every day, and I treat patients. I'm involved in treating paediatric malignancy in particular, in young children with a rare form of cancer called neuroblastoma. I treat most of the children in Melbourne with that particular disease using radioisotopes. And so I have a lot of interaction with them, their families, their parents and their siblings, and that's an incredibly worthwhile thing for me. It's great that I can have a second family, if you like. My 4 children are grown up now, but I'm having new children coming through, and seeing them do well is really encouraging. And so reading about that process is, I guess, an important part of what we do, but the experience that we have and we bring to that is very important.
Jayashri, what about you?
Well, I was just thinking to myself that the worst thing was that we had to read the. I'm not Freud bashing, but it sounds like it. We had to read about the analytical interviewing methods, and you know, the interview went like, you sit there with the patient and you don't say anything. In fact, I used to get told, just put a sock in it, you're talking too much. And then of course the patient would say something and you'd go, uh-huh. And you'd be looking at the patient, they'd be looking back at you, and there'd be another, uh-huh. And then it would be that the person says something and then you paraphrase it. So you feeling bad today? And I said, well, I just said that. And when you say you're feeling bad, you mean you're feeling bad. And it would just be this circular, weird kind of situation.
Is it supposed to help?
Well, that's what I'm saying. So it was, in fact, the interviewing that we had to read about was not helpful. It was something that really you sort of discarded the book side of it and then went to social skills and interaction with patients and learn more from that.
So what books did you read to help you with that?
I think the biggest influence I mentioned before was the Yalom book. Really, I thought was very good, practical conversation skills.
What about someone like Oliver Sacks?
Oliver Sacks' books are brilliant, very neurological, but you know what it was about was just saying, look, just be normal. You know, don't be too weird. Just try and be normal in interaction.
But Oliver Sacks is a bit of a strange chap when you meet him and interview him.
I haven't met him, but you know, you'd be very fortunate that you have. But I mean, certainly his books talk about the conversation between the doctor and patient is more probing than a conversation, but you have to have an ordinary connection with the person to start with, and I think they're the things that really make an impact when you read books about conversations, and we had to do a lot of reading about conversations.
Jayashri, just before I get to Chris again, but is it important to know what your patients are reading? Is
Yes,
that interesting
absolutely.
for you?
I find it fascinating, and also sharing sometimes the books that you might like somebody to read, and so they will tell you back about what they're reading as well. And I think it's fantastic bilateral conversation. So sometimes, yes, people I've been working with will go away and read the Yalom stuff, or they'll come back, and I've asked people to read other books, Dance with Anger and so on, and we'll share what's happened in that session, and they will tell me what to read.
So is it interesting for you to know that they've loved this book or they've hated that book?
And sometimes it's almost the triangulation of somebody can tell you about a character who's a real pain because that character has problems with this, that or the other, and it's less threatening than talking about self. And that's another way of getting some insight into what's happening.
Well, Chris, Mary, as a surgeon and bedside manner, they don't have a very good rep, do they?
No, that would be true. I think that...
Come in and say, let's have a look at that chest and we're going to do this.
Yeah, and that's an improvement on 30 years ago, where they would come in and say, don't you worry your pretty little face about what's going to happen tomorrow, you leave that up to us. But look, I think that, what we know now is that the relationship that a patient has with their doctor, whether it's in radiation, whether it's in cancer medicine, psychiatry, surgery, cardiology, whatever, that is one of the biggest factors that predetermines how well they're going to go with their treatment, no matter what it is. And we know that if you have a bad relationship with your medical practitioner, your outcome is likely to be poor.
So you have to build confidence.
Yeah, and I think the way you build confidence in a patient is by understanding the human condition, no matter which area of medicine you're in. And I guess I would say that the classics are classics for a reason, whether it's To Kill a Mockingbird or Kafka or whether it's reading The Source or whatever that one was, that the most popular book in the world last year, or whether or not you read
Twilight,
it's a very good series. Whether you read Twilight or Dan Brown or whatever it is.
So you read popular fiction to make a connection with your patients?
That's the only reason why I do it, yes.
You've admitted it.
I have to read it. No, I think that you have to understand. I mean, all the reading that you do informs you as an individual and informs your interactions, because all books have conversations in them, and they all, whether it's between a lovelorn 17-year-old lusting after a vampire or a man who's turned into a beetle, it's they're all about human emotion, and those things I think probably help you more than perhaps we realise on a day-to-day basis.
So, Rod, with your work with cancer patients, Susan Sontag, Illness as Metaphor, was a very important book. She'd had breast cancer, I think. She actually died of breast cancer. But she's sort of written about the idea that, I suppose, in those times before, as she was writing it, there was a whole movement about people who aren't positive about their lives are going to get cancer, and there's all kinds of things that you can...
Not going to be survivors from it. That whole guilt trip of if I don't have a positive attitude, I'm going to die. And the opposite of that, people spending inordinate amounts of time and money on avoiding conventional care to access positive enlightenment that might give them a better outcome. It's a very difficult situation. You can understand people are desperate when they have cancer, and you want to support them in that, but often they'll make very bad choices in the course of that process. The thing that really struck me about the process of death and dying, having come from an area where I was working in coronary care units, where a young father of 35 or 45 would have gone to work having had an argument with his wife in the morning and not spoken to his kids, had a massive heart attack, and then had a stroke, and then never woken up. And the devastation that I saw in the families, that they could never get over the idea that somehow that the anxiety or the angst that caused their father had led to his direct death. They'd never had the opportunity to tell their father that they loved him, to resolve the issues. We don't get that in cancer. There's lots of time, and in a sense, while it's a very difficult dying process, there's incredible value in that process of dying, that people do get to resolve the issues that they have with their family. And I go to quite a few of my patients' funerals, and you might say that's a morbid thing for a doctor to do, but I treat patients with chronic cancers, slowly growing indolent cancers, and in the process that we have no expectation of ever curing them, but we improve the quality and the duration of their life, and because of that we become their friends, and we see events in their life. And the one I went to earlier this year was a guy I'd been treating for 15 years, and going to his funeral to see, they'd had a slideshow in the chapel of his life, And most of the pictures were from the last 15 years of him having his farewell from work, retiring, having his 65th and then his 75th birthday, having his first grandchildren, seeing his daughters finish school, university, and so those life experiences. And you know, someone could look at that and say that's a failure because he wasn't cured. He died of his disease eventually. But I see it as a great victory because he had all those life experiences. And
do your patients read as they're checking out? I mean, and what do they read? And does this inform your knowledge of how they're feeling and what they're going through?
I have a quote on my my board in my office that I show the patients, because they always ask, "How long am I going to live, doc? You know, have I got 3 months? Have I got should I take Tatslotto tickets or whatever out?" And it's from Horace: "Happy the man and happy he alone who can call today his own, who secure within can say, tomorrow do they worse because I've lived today." And I tell my patients that, and I say, look at that, and sometimes I have my bike in the corner of my office and I say, I'm more likely to die being hit by a car tomorrow than you are to die tomorrow from your cancer, but I'm living for today. I enjoy riding my bike and I'm going to go on doing that, and you should do that as well.
Well, you're on the book show here on ABC Radio National. We're doing our monthly Reading on Vocation event here at the Wheeler Centre, and I'm with Doctors Jayashri, Kulkarni, Chris Merry and Rod Hicks, and you're on ABC Radio National. Now, Chris, you're interested in reading about medical ethics too, and tell me what sort of reading that is.
Well, that's really... I guess part of the fact that we've done, I've done a lot of presentation in this area, I guess, on other radio stations about medical ethics. But really, the interest lies because I think that when you look at ethics, there have been some unbelievably bad doctors out there, and there's and people are more than happy to publish stories about them. There's one in the press at the moment.
Now, let's not mention any current.
No, okay. No, there's one in trial at the moment, and
we especially won't mention that.
And the book written by the I think it was the Brisbane Courier journalist on that case just opened up a fascinating look at how, again, the systems can go wrong to allow unethical behaviour to occur, and usually it's a system error that happens. I mean, there will always be rogue doctors who behave badly, but often it's misguided treatment that becomes unethical because the checks and balances aren't in place. And so reading around those topics is very interesting, but also very informative.
So, Medical Murder by Robert Kaplan.
Yeah, that was a less informative book. I mean, he writes a great, again, sort of anecdotes of various case studies of various practitioners throughout the centuries who have committed murder, and these are really rogue doctors. But the fascinating part about it, I guess, is at the beginning when he classifies rogue doctors into varying types as being accidentally rogue or being deliberate. Sociopaths or psychopaths, I suppose would be the correct term, yes. And how that and the societal pressures or the societal boundaries that allow a doctor who has those tendencies to effectively go on doing what they want to do with no checks and balances. And again, I guess that's really what happens in the hospital setting when unethical behaviour occurs, is because somebody doesn't stand up and say, hang on a second, you're doing the wrong thing, we need to have a look at this.
What about patient memoirs? My life with cancer, or my life with schizophrenia, or my new heart. Does this interest you from the point of view of the other side of the desk?
Yeah, it's fascinating. In fact, I showed the person producing this program the book that's written about the bipolar patient who has written a book with her mother. So half the book is the mother's experience of her daughter with the illness, and the other half is the actual woman's girl experience with the illness. And I actually can't get enough of the patient experiences written, because it really is a great guideline. Don't do this because that's not what we want. it's all there. It's laid out, and some of the
Have you had to
Kate
change
Jamison-
your practice when
Yeah,
you've read something? Like what?
Absolutely. I mean, I wish everyone could read some of the Kate Jamison books and so on, because such things as just when I tell you that this is a problem for me, put that at the top of your to-do list to help me with. Don't put your to-do list ahead of my to-do list. That's really important. And those messages keep coming through the literature really well. And Kay Jamison writes beautifully about touch with fire and so on. So again, you know, a lot of the time it is good for particularly younger doctors, I think, to be asked to read those first-person accounts by the patients themselves.
A short Blood and Guts, a short history of medicine. Rod, one of your favourites. You're interested in the history of medicine.
Yeah, I have been interested in the history of medicine for a very long time, and also the literary associations in medicine. You're probably aware that many of the classic writers were actually doctors as well. Anton Chekhov, I think, said that medicine was his legal wife and literature was his mistress, and when he got bored with one, he spent the night with the other. And neither suffered for the experience. So he also said, I think, that the difference between lawyers and doctors is that lawyers will rob you, but doctors will rob you and kill you. So he had a somewhat unusual perception of medicine,
but accurate. You would
but
have
accurate,
thought.
yeah, probably. So that whole area of where we've come from and where we're going. In all history, I think, unless we look back and understand how it's evolved, where it came from, we tend to reinvent the mistakes of the past. And the only way to move forward is to understand those changes. And a little while ago, I was reading the dialogues in Plato's Republic, and he was talking about this issue about novelty and new things, and how and that's been really a very strong issue for me, developing a new technology, trying to get it approved and funded and accepted into the medical mainstream. And there's this beautiful passage that Plato wrote about how old wisdom is accepted and new things are never agreed to, and everyone tries to push down the new. And so unless you've read that and you sort of think, well, you know, why am I being victimised? You know, why don't people understand that this is new and revolutionary? You know, it's been happening for thousands of years.
Well, Chris, what about the history of surgery? I mean, that can be excruciating, can't it?
Yeah, particularly if you were there. I think what Rod said is right. You sort of feel when you're putting a research project together and the 28 pages of ethics applications that you have to do and the 6 months turnaround and things. But when you look back at the history of surgery and the history of medicine, the fascinating thing are the first timers, the people who went out and did stuff the first time. And there was, I guess it's a release for me and probably Rod too, because you think, my God, how good would that be to be able to do that now? And I look at in my field in particular, in cardiac surgery, which has really sort of exploded in the last 50 years, the guys that developed the first heart-lung machine, a guy called John Kirkland and his wife, they were in Boston in the 30s. And he and his wife would go down to the Boston docks at night with a tin of tuna and a gunny sack, and they would get the stray cats, and they would tempt them with a tuna, grab them and put them in the sack and take them back to the lab and then use them in their experiments on developing the heart-lung machine, which not good for the animal liberationists, sorry. But you know, the ability to sort of, almost like that Frankenstein in his lab kind of thing that Shelley wrote about, and just to be able to develop those technologies on your own without the administrative oversight probably goes back to the anti-ethical stuff I was talking about before. But that is, I mean, medical and surgical history is littered with experiments like that. The other one that comes to mind is the permanent pacemaker that regulates heart rate in people that have heart conduction problems. Now that was developed in Europe in the 50s again. And the time between development or conception of the idea and implantation into the first human was 2 weeks. 2 weeks. There was a guy in the hospital, the engineering department of the hospital, who'd made the battery and had sort of been with a heart and electrodes and was getting it to beat. And there was a patient whose wife was very determined, and she heard about this guy, and she knocked on his door and said, "My husband's in the hospital for the 20th time this year. I want you to put the pacemaker in." And they sort of went, "Oh, I don't know if we can do that." And she said, "Well, he's going to die if you don't." So they did it. He lived 40 years. You know, and this is the sort of thing that we would never be able to do that today. Probably for a good reason, but that's why it's so fascinating. The people that had the guts and the foresight and the inspiration, I guess, to achieve amazing things that we will never, ever be able to replicate today.
John Hunter doing the same thing, holding soirees where his wife would have book readings and music, and he and his assistant were out the back, William Bailey, dissecting bodies that they'd got people to go out and buy for them to do their dissection. Or
DeBakey, who did the first aortic arch replacement. There was nothing to, the person had a distended aorta, there was nothing to replace it with. So he went home, got a piece, went to the local dressmaker, presumably got a piece of impermeable cloth, went to his wife's sewing machine, sewed it on his wife's sewing machine at home, took it to the hospital the next day and put it into the patient. I mean, this is sort of thing that, you know, we would never... My wife doesn't even have a sewing machine, but I would never dare to do something like that.
What about fiction and reading for pleasure and fun? Jayashri, what do you read for fun?
Well, I'm actually in a book club and have been for 21 years now. I started it when I had my first child, and I didn't want Brain to go into complete sort of cobweb territory when I was at home, and so I started a book club, and so I'm often reading what we're doing in the book club, and we've done a spectacular sort of range of books. But in actual fact, I have to confess that I'm actually reading the Harry Potter again. And again. I love it. And
Why?
It's not because it's fun, and it's the nerdy kid who did good. You know, the kid who was really outcast and just no one, you know, gave him the time of day, and it was terrible, and then all of a sudden he's this superstar. And, you know, maybe that's my fantasy that I was always the nerdy kid or whatever, but I just love it. My kids absolutely love it as well, and it's another connection as well. So it's again reading what's current.
What about you, Rod?
Well, I had a hiatus with children as well. You know, I guess in the medical profession, you build up your career at the most difficult time when you've got young children. They're growing up, and you're very busy, and you're having to do a lot of reading around your work. And so I made the conscious decision that I would read to them when I came home from work to spend time with them. And so I've read Lord of the Rings 4 times to my children, to each of them in succession. Complete with voices which have gradually morphed to the movies as time's gone by, because Tom Bombadil used to be very different than he didn't even appear in the film, so I didn't have to change Tom Bombadil, but Pippin became Irish, and you know, so my kids hated the movies because they said that's not the right voice for Pippin and Merry. So I've done a lot of that in reading Emily Rodder and Harry Potter and all those sort of things. But in the, you know, there's a nice advertisement where the dad comes home, and the only person or thing that greets the dad coming home is the dog. That's my life now, and so I've got back to reading again, and I try and read a novel or something non-medical every fortnight or so. And so
what are you reading now?
I'm reading World Without End by Ken Follett. I'm quite interested in history, not only medical history but general history, and so I read. I call it tangential reading. That if I come to something that I don't know much about, I think I should read something about. I'll change and read on something around that, and so I sort of. That whole medieval period, I've done a lot of study around the Renaissance and Renaissance art and that sort of period, and again the interface between the Christian Europe and Islamic world and the Mughal world. And when I was travelling in India, seeing the place called the Qutub Minar in Delhi, this beautiful tower pillar that was around an Islamic university from the 11th and 12th century, and I thought, I know nothing about this culture and need to read about it, and then started to then understand, about the Crusades, read about the Crusades, and then go on and understand what was happening in medieval Europe. Why was it so backward compared to what was happening in the Mughal, the Islamic world at that time?
And what about you, Chris? Are you a novel reader for fun?
Yeah, a lot. But I suppose, yes, I've read Lord of the Rings and I've read all of Harry Potter, and I guess, I really enjoy... I'm surprised to hear you both say that, because I thought I was going to be really lowbrow, but I really enjoy science fiction and post-apocalyptic fiction. I'm reading Oryx and Crake, Margaret Atwood's trilogy, or soon-to-be trilogy at the moment. Maybe it's an escape from the very rigid scientific nature of what we all do every day, and so that if...
Mistress, the legal one.
Yeah, exactly. And so if you read that stuff, it's so different to what we do, and so fantastic for a reason, I guess.